When I first married Andrew, he worked for my father, and that's how our paths crossed. After our wedding, we decided that I would stay home, allowing me time to pursue hobbies like sewing and knitting. Every winter, I poured my love into creating scarves and gloves for him, each one better than the last. Andrew, always encouraging, once compared my handmade gifts to store-bought ones, which filled me with pride. I imagined a future where I could pass this craft on to our children, a dream that brought us both joy. 6 years of marriage later, Andrew and I had not yet had children, but we found contentment in our shared life. Despite his demanding job, he made an effort to spend time with me on his days off, and I cherished those moments. Yet, there were times when his work pulled him away, leaving me feeling isolated. Then, 3 years ago, everything changed. One day, I collapsed from dizziness at home. Andrew rushed me to the hospital, and when I regained consciousness, I overheard him discussing my condition with the doctor. It was serious, something I would have to manage for the rest of my life, though not immediately life-threatening. My illness meant future hospitalizations were inevitable. In that moment of uncertainty, Andrew stayed by my side, offering reassurance. As I lay in the hospital, surrounded by the scarves and gloves I had knit over the years, I heard Andrew say something that struck me deeply. "I married you because you're the boss's daughter." His words, though perhaps thoughtlessly spoken, felt like a harsh awakening. I realized then that I needed to confront him about his feelings and the direction our marriage had taken. We had once dreamed of growing old together, cherishing simple joys like my knitting, but something had shifted. Despite his attempts to comfort me during my hospital stay, his presence seemed to lessen over time. At first, he visited nearly every day, bringing my sewing supplies and spending hours with me. We stitched together, sharing small talk and finding comfort in each other's company. But after a year, his visits became less frequent, and I could only assume his work was to blame. I continued knitting, finishing a scarf and a pair of gloves I planned to give him when he next came. When he finally visited, I eagerly handed him the gloves, only to be met with a cold, dismissive reaction. "Are you still making these? It's annoying," he said, pushing the gloves and the scarf I had made back into my hands, along with divorce papers. The shock of his words cut deeper than any illness ever could. He explained that he couldn't continue caring for me, that it was time to end things. The papers had already been signed, marking the end of our marriage. I had sensed the shift in our relationship, but facing the reality of it was unbearable. I had convinced myself his neglect was due to work pressures, but deep down, I knew the man I married wouldn't have abandoned me like this.
When I finally asked him why he wanted a divorce,
I wasn't pleading for him to stay. I had come to realize that, perhaps, I had become a burden to him. If that was truly what he wanted, I had to accept it, no matter how much it hurt. Andrew's response when I asked about the change in him was blunt and unforgiving. "Isn't it obvious? Ever since I married you, it's been one problem after another. I'm tired of those scarves and gloves. Honestly, I only married you because your dad was my boss," he confessed with a laugh that cut through me like a blade. His words shattered the image I had of our life together.
what had once been tokens of my love, those scarves and gloves, had become a source of resentment to him.
And as I looked at the finely made scarf around his neck, I realized it wasn't one of mine. He had never valued the gifts I made. They had always been a nuisance to him. The truth was even more painful than I had imagined. After my father retired, Andrew no longer felt the need to maintain the facade of a caring husband. During the first year of my illness, his visits had seemed genuine, but I soon understood they were motivated by something else. At work, his colleagues praised him for his dedication, and it seemed his visits to me were more about preserving his image than showing real concern. When I confronted him about this, Andrew admitted, without any remorse,
that my condition had actually made things easier for him.
"If I worked late, everyone praised me for being so dedicated, and if I needed a break, I just told them my wife was sick," he said, almost boasting. It had worked to his advantage, earning him promotions and breaks, all at the expense of my health. As his true nature became clear to me, the man I once loved was replaced by someone I barely recognized. It was a painful realization, but I accepted it quietly. "Well, if my illness was useful to you,
then I guess that's something.
We probably won't see each other again," I said calmly, handing him the divorce papers. He took them without a second glance and left without a word, ending our marriage without a trace of regret. Afterward, I felt the full weight of the loss. I cried, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. When I returned home, my father was furious at Andrew's actions. "I never thought he'd stoop so low," he said, shocked by the revelation. Though I was heartbroken, I reassured my father that I was okay. I wanted to stay with them for a while, and they supported my decision. The next day, when I visited our old house, I discovered it had been sold. A stranger now lived there with his family. My parents were upset, but I chose not to cause any trouble. I left quietly, not looking back. When Andrew and I first crossed paths, he was working for my father, and from that initial meeting, a quiet, unspoken bond began to form between us. What started as a professional relationship gradually blossomed into something deeper, and before long, we were married. We made the decision that I would stay home after our wedding, dedicating myself to the hobbies I cherished: sewing, knitting, and the small, everyday comforts these crafts brought me. Winter after winter, I poured my love and care into making scarves and gloves for Andrew, each pair a little more refined than the last. His words of praise meant everything to me. He often compared my creations to store-bought items, and that comparison, though humble, filled me with a quiet, comforting pride. I envisioned a future where I could teach our child the art of knitting,
A future where our family was bound together not just by blood,
but by the simple, timeless act of creating something with our own hands. 6 years passed, and although we hadn't yet started a family of our own, I felt content. Our life together was fulfilling in many ways. Andrew's job was demanding, pulling him away for long hours, but he always made an effort to spend his days off with me. Those fleeting moments together became a sacred part of my routine, and even though I sometimes felt the sting of his absence, especially when his work took him away for days at a time, I cherished the time we shared. Still, there were times when loneliness crept in, and I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation, even in the house we shared, even with him nearby. Then, 3 years ago, everything changed. One ordinary day, I suddenly collapsed, dizzy and disoriented. Andrew's panic was palpable as he rushed me to the hospital. I woke up to the sterile, blinding light of a hospital room, and overheard Andrew speaking with the doctor. My condition was serious, something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. While it wasn't immediately life-threatening, the prospect of future episodes and long, uncertain hospital stays weighed heavily on us both. My anxiety soared, but Andrew's presence, his steadfast reassurance, became my anchor. He promised we would face this challenge together, and in those early days, I clung to his words. However, during one of my longer hospital stays, I had a moment of clarity, a bitter realization that I hadn't wanted to confront. As I lay there,
recovering,
my eyes landed on the pile of scarves and gloves I had knitted over the years, now discarded carelessly in the corner of the room.
The sight was a sharp contrast to the passion and care I had poured into each stitch.
And then, Andrew spoke. His words cut through the room, more painful than anything I had endured up until that point. "I married you because you're the boss's daughter," he said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. It was a harsh truth, one I hadn't been ready to hear, but in that moment, I understood. Things between us had changed in ways I hadn't fully seen, hadn't wanted to admit. I had always believed that we were partners, that our connection ran deeper than anything superficial, but his words shattered that illusion, and I realized that I needed to have a conversation with him, to understand what had shifted between us, to find out if there was anything left of the man I had married, the man who had once promised to stand by me. Despite his reassurances and his quiet attempts to comfort me, there was an undeniable shift in our relationship. He visited me in the hospital, holding my hand, telling me not to worry, and promising he'd be there whenever he could. I clung to those promises, thinking that together, we could weather any storm. At first, he kept his word. His visits became a small but significant part of my routine. He even brought my knitting tools, and we spent hours in the sterile hospital room, laughing, talking, and stitching together. It was a lifeline, a brief escape from the harsh reality of my illness. I cherished those moments as if they were the last scraps of something beautiful that was slowly slipping away. But as time wore on, his visits began to dwindle. What had once been a daily ritual became less frequent, turning into something I could count on only once every few weeks. I told myself it was just the pressure of work, that he was simply too busy, but deep down, I felt the growing distance between us, the emptiness and the silence left by his absence. Even as I continued my knitting, finishing another scarf and a pair of gloves, hoping to gift them to him as a sign of my enduring love, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When he did finally visit again, I handed him the scarf and gloves I had so carefully crafted, my heart brimming with hope. But the moment he saw them, his face soured. "Are you still making these?" he asked, his voice flat. "It's annoying." He shoved the items back into my hands without a second glance, and in that same breath, he handed me divorce papers. The cold finality of the gesture took my breath away. I couldn't comprehend it. How had we arrived at this moment? His words were a blur as he explained that he could no longer care for me, that he had to move on, that it was time for us to part ways. It wasn't anger I felt in that moment, it was disbelief.
The reality of what was happening crashed over me like a wave.
I had always known there was distance between us, but the truth was more brutal than I had imagined. The man I had married, who had promised to love me in sickness and in health, was now the one walking away. I wasn't desperate, but I had to ask. I needed to understand.
Why?
I whispered, my voice barely audible. It wasn't a plea. I had already come to terms with the fact that I was no longer the woman he had loved.
I had become a burden to him.
And he had made his choice. The pain was sharp, but I accepted it. In that moment, I realized the life we had dreamed of together, the future we had once imagined,
was no longer within reach.